Well, the Lucretius's book is is an odd kind of book. That is, it's a poem, and it is at the same time a philosophical treatise. There are very few books that attempt to put those two things together, philosophy and poetry. And many people say that it's a complete failure. John Ruskin, this was probably the book of all books that he detested more than any. He said this was just versified.
And he detested an awful lot.
He did, yes. That's saying something. Yeah. He had strong feelings, negative feelings about a lot of things. But this book he hated from his early. He changed his mind. He never cared, when he was young, he didn't care very much about Virgil. But he changed his mind. He finally took it in school, and it put him on. And then later on he came to it when he was more mature, and then he loved it. He saw its greatness. But Virgil he hated from youth. Lucretius. Yes, he hated consistently all through his life. He said a person who really likes Virgil must have a heart, he said, made of flint. If you really like Virgil. I'm sorry, I keep saying Virgil, I mean Lucretius. But he is a very powerful writer. He's not to be underestimated.
Well, flint is sparky stuff.
Yes.
It seems at first that's just a corny sort of an image for him to use, but it's pretty good. Actually.
Yeah.
The thing about Ruskin is even when he chose a cliche, he meant exactly that and not something else. He didn't say a heart of stone, I take it. He said a heart of flint.
He said flint shingle. I don't know. Flint shingle, he said.
Yeah. But he does strike sparks, I think. He's flinty. I think that's a very good image for him. Sometimes we would call him crusty. There is a kind of, I find, now I don't know, maybe Ruskin would not say this, but I find a certain delight in Lucretius. That is, he articulates terrible things so well that you do find a sort of, at first you're appalled by it, and then you put the book down and you say, gee, let's read that again. You couldn't put it more clearly than that. He also has a kind of a personality emerges from the book. You get to know Lucretius. If someone else made him up, if this were fiction and Lucretius was a character, the author would be highly praised for making up such a true-to-life character.
I feel about him along the same lines, the same way I feel toward Bertrand Russell, who belongs to the same school of thought, really, in many ways. They're quite similar. Bertrand Russell had an extraordinary ability to put his position in an absolutely stunning way, I've over the years I've come to regard Bertrand Russell as he's one of the most reliable men you'll ever find. That is, you can pick him up anywhere and he will always be absolutely wrong, but always tremendously impressive in the way that he puts things. And once again, you will see a certain character shining through everything that he writes. He's not one of those impersonal writers that stands off from his writing. He's always there. There's a certain character in there. Bertrand Russell never wrote a kind of masterpiece as Lucretius did, but he does have that same quality about him. Not a poet, though. A rhetorician.
He's a rhetorician. He stays on the level.
He's at a lower level than Lucretius.
I haven't articulated what I mean, perhaps, but Lucretius takes the burden of his own philosophy on his shoulders. The thing that annoys me about Bertrand Russell, granted his brilliance, is that he gets away with it. Mm-hmm. I mean, Russell gets away with it. Russell didn't die of an aphrodisiac. He lived to be 100 and went on forever and kept chirping away forever. Never took the consequences of his own stuff. But Lucretius really does take it all on himself. He was a desperately unhappy man. I have the feeling about Russell is he was sort of happy.
Yeah, yes, he professed that.
Yeah, but Lucretius really has a black view of the universe, and he's obsessed by it. And he knows how really awful it is. Those passages about the plague, especially, and there's nothing like that in the whole of literature. Anything as ugly as that. I guess some people have said that perhaps in the 18th century there are some imitations. I've never read. Is Defoe anything like that? I've never read the Journal of the Plague.
No, he doesn't.
He doesn't do that.
No, he isn't morbid. He describes.
Well, maybe Swift sometimes is accused of that. A little bit at the end of, well, not a little bit, but that ugliness at the end of Gulliver. Mark Twain has a little of this.
Bitterness.
Had a lot of it. But not with the greatness of Lucretius, I don't think. What I'm trying to say is that if you're going to take this position, Lucretius really has to take credit for retiring the whole thing. I don't think anybody has ever faced up to the consequences of a pure philosophy of hedonism. That can be misunderstood. A philosophy of living for yourself would be a better way of putting it. And not for anything else. Philosophy of self. Epicureans live entirely for themselves. I said hedonism, and that gives the wrong impression of having a lot of good food and a lot of good wine and so on.
Yeah, we were saying last time that's
he's far above.
Not true.
No,
it's the pleasures of the mind are the greatest pleasures.
But nonetheless, he lives for pleasure. But it is
pleasure.
But it's a very high kind of pleasure, and he really lives with the consequences of that philosophy. And the consequences of that philosophy are the most horrifying desperation. Just utter gloom. I always remember a horror movie with Bela Lugosi, who always played the part of Count Dracula. And he was standing by some French doors in his elegant Hungarian estate castle, and the rain was pouring down. Someone came out and said, "What are you doing?" And terrible things had happened. Vampires had been flitting about. And there was a really comic moment in this movie. He said, "I'm watching the rain." He said, well, what is it doing? And he says, "It's falling down." He said this.
Yeah, that marvelous
Count Dracula.
Yeah, that marvelous voice. Yes. That marvelous voice.
And I have an image of Lucretius sort of looking at the universe and saying, "What is it doing?" It's falling down. And now isn't it true that there's almost something comic about this book? It's so bad that you find yourself chuckling. I don't say so much laughing, but there's a certain kind of chuckle. Well, there he goes. He's going to do it again, and he does it, and he goes all the way with it.
Well, listen to this. That your remark reminded me about falling. This is the end of Book 2. In this way, the ramparts of the great world also will be breached and collapse in crumbling ruin about us. Already it is far past its prime. The earth which generated every living species and once brought forth from its womb the bodies of huge beasts has now scarcely strength to generate animalcules. I don't know how to pronounce that word. For I assume that the races of mortal creatures were not let down into the fields from heaven by a golden cord, nor generated from the sea or the rock-beating surf, but born of the same earth that now provides their nurture, the same earth in her prime spontaneously generated for mortals smiling crops and lusty vines, sweet fruits and gladsome pastures, which now can scarcely be made to grow by our toil. We wear down the oxen and wear out the strength of husbandmen, and the plowshare is scarcely a match for fields that grudge their fruits and multiply our toil. Already the plowman of ripe years shakes his head with many a sigh that his heavy labors have gone for nothing. And when he compares the present with the past, he often cries up his father's luck and grumbles that past generations, when men were old-fashioned and God-fearing, supported life easily enough on their small farms, though one man's holding was then far less than now. In the same despondent vein, the cultivator of old and wilted vines decries the trend of the times and rails at heaven. He does not realize that everything is gradually decaying and nearing its end, worn out by old age.
I find that just charming. Just absolutely charming. It's so bad. It is just so bad. And he's a man who so well written. I don't mean bad in the literary sense. It's marvelous.
Yeah.
But I mean the view of the universe is so gloomy that here's a man who started out with a philosophy of pleasure, and when he looks at the universe, and he's very honest. This is what he sees. Russell, I think, can be contrasted. Russell agrees with all of that.
Yeah.
And says all that.
But he's happy.
He's happy.
He thinks everything's getting better and better.
He was not, as you said, he's not a poet. He doesn't contemplate it.
No.
He argues it and proves it and is convinced of it. But this guy rudes.
He sees where it all ends. The poet does see the end of things, and to that extent, Lucretius is a poet.
There's a greatness there. Cardinal Newman was not writing about Lucretius. I think he was writing about the Roman poet Seneca, perhaps. I forget in particular who it was. Someone had written Newman a letter saying, "Why should we read the classics?" Or maybe it was even Horace. I can't remember. But anyway, why should we read the classics? And Newman said, well, with the really great ones, you get a vision of what it's like to live without God, which is very profound. It's a vision, and it can convert you. If you look at that, I can see people getting to the end of this book and saying, I'm not going to take that route. This can't be all there is.
Can't be right.
This can't be. Yeah. Lucretius, so far as we know, never did. There's not the slightest evidence that Lucretius ever deviated one jot from this view.
Well,
but Virgil did. Yeah. Virgil started out. Now we don't really know these things. I must admit, this is a lot of scholarly speculation. But there's a kind of consensus, I think, among Virgilian scholars that Virgil started out as a Lucretian. He certainly imitated his verse. You can trace it in his poems. And there are passages which are almost word for word, and plagiarisms in some cases. And the consensus is that Virgil was exactly such a person, that as he read Lucretius and said, there must be something else. And he didn't know what it was. That is, for Virgil, it couldn't be a conversion to Christianity because St. Paul wasn't there to preach to him. So Virgil was left with a kind of a gloom, as we talked about this a great deal, a sort of a twilight sadness. But Virgil is certainly convinced that this can't be all. And that's as far as he goes.
Yeah, there's still some hope. Yeah. Hope in Virgil.
Very dark hope, but he had rejected Lucretius, saying whatever this is the most reasoned view of the universe that you can have, and it cannot be right. There must be something else. And Virgil never says what that is. He was never given that gift, at least in his writings. We don't know, but there's no evidence that. But he does at least go beyond Lucretius in this respect. Thomas Hardy is a little bit this way. I was trying to grapple from modern examples, and I would say that Hardy, I guess this is an irreverent thing to say, but Hardy tickles me. I find his poetry especially. I'm not sure his novels do. They kind of get you bored after a while because he's so damn gloomy that you put the book down. But in his poetry, you get this same Lucretian thing, and it becomes almost comic. I think you just sort of smile and you say, well, Well, he's certainly consistent. He hears a bird sing, and what does it remind him of? Oh, how terrible! The bird's going to die, and everything is gone. I mean, he looks at beautiful things. So in that passage you read, there's a sort of remarkable poetic gift. He talks about
Yes.
orchards and apple trees. And I can't remember some of the passages where he describes things. He had a sense of beauty. He sees it, but then he says, "Oh, but it's all going to go. It's all going to die."
The same smiling earth in her prime, spontaneously generated for mortals smiling crops and lusty vines.
Those are exactly the words. Virgil uses that at the beginning of the Georges, almost word for word.
Gladsome pastures. That is, there's a nostalgia there.
Yeah.
Once again,
he does have an eye for the beautiful. He sees it, but then it's all gone. I think the gloom settles in.
Well, it gets into his poetics. That is, to his idea of poetry.
Mm-hmm.
He says a couple of times in the book. He puts forward a theory of poetry. It's become very famous, very well known. That is, it's called the sugar-coating theory. He says, beginning of book 4, he says, "I am blazing a trail through pathless tracts of the Muses' Pierian realm, where no foot has ever trod before." There he is, sounding again like the beginning where he talks about Epicurus.
He's bragging, yeah.
Bragging about going through trackless wastes. And then again, what joy it is to light upon virgin springs and drink their waters. What joy to pluck new flowers and gather for my brow a glorious garland from fields whose blossoms were never yet wreathed by the muses round any head. This is my reason for teaching these lofty topics, for struggling to loose men's minds from the tight knots of superstition and shedding on dark corners the bright beam of my song that irradiates everything with the sparkle of the muses. My art is not without a purpose. Physicians, when they wish to treat children with a nasty dose of wormwood, first smear the rim of the cup with a coat of yellow honey. The children too young as yet for foresight are lured by the sweetness at their lips into swallowing the bitter draught. So they are tricked, but not trapped, for the treatment restores them to health. In the same way, our doctrine often seems unpalatable to those who have not sampled it, and the multitude shrink from it. That is why I have tried to administer it to you in the dulcet strains of poesy, coated with the sweet honey of the muses. My object has been to engage your mind with my verses while you gain insight into the nature of the universe and learn to appreciate the profit you are reaping.
I mean, that is just marvelous, because what he's saying is that his philosophy and for that matter reality is just something absolutely ghastly.
Yeah.
So what we have to do is sugarcoat it. You know, really, I do think you have to give him credit. There's nobody as good as that, who's ever done that as well. When you said that Lucretius was the man Ruskin detested the most, I guess I'll have to part company with Ruskin. I'm scared to death to do that because I admire him so much. But I've never felt that way about Lucretius. I've always been charmed by him. Isn't that exactly the opposite? What he just said there is exactly the opposite, really, of what, let's say James Joyce does. What James Joyce does is take a very sweet and delightful drink and coat it with bitterness. He coats it with ugliness. That is, James Joyce tries to sell his book with a popular explosion of immediately visible ugliness.
Yeah, well, it's the whole what's the phrase about the sea? The
snot green sea.
Yeah, that's the great example. Whereas in Homer, of course, it's always the wine dark sea.
And I think what Lucretius would say is, well, just between you and me, I agree with Joyce.
Right.
But you don't say that. You start out with Homer, and you lead somebody into seeing how ugly it really is. But what Joyce does is start out with the ugliness because it shocks you, and he really wants to win you over. And I just mentioned James Joyce, but you could take modern art, for example, the same way.
Thing is, Ruskin never lived to see James Joyce.
That's true. That's true.
He never got things were that bad.
Lucretius would have looked pretty good.
That's right. He would have looked back on Lucretius with nostalgia.
I guess that's what I'm doing. I'm really looking back on him. He's old-fashioned in his ways. That's true. That's real. I mean, and that's not just a quip. That's really true. It's really true. That the things that Ruskin rails against at the end of the 19th century. He thought that Whistler was modernistic, and
he thought things couldn't get any worse.
Any worse than Whistler. And to make a pun, we're very wistful about old Whistler. He looks very pretty to us. That's really true. But it is true that I think it's legitimate to include Lucretius in a course of great books, not only because he had a lot of influence, and therefore you couldn't possibly kick him out. He articulates the Epicurean view. He's the only one who does. That is, of the great writers, he's the only one who does. Epicurus himself, not having written anything, and nothing survives. But also, I think he ought to be on there in his own right. That is, I hope everybody reads it. I guess I'm stressing this because I can remember a certain effect that our lectures used to have on students, and I regret that. They used to say, "Oh, the heck with it, we're not going to read it."
Yeah, we're not going to read it. If it's that bad, we're not going to read it.
And they were wrong. That is, it really is worth reading. Not only for the purple passages, which are so well done.
Well, that's one of them. The one that I just read.
And we've read about three of them now.
Yes, we read them.
They're as good as anything in the history of poetry. They're just marvelous. But also, the whole book deserves to be read. That is, even the most ghastly and dreadful passages, because they articulate this gloom with such an honesty. The man is consistent with what he does. He doesn't lie about it. He doesn't he doesn't try to fool you into thinking that this is a view of life that you can get away with. I think what makes me mad about Bertrand Russell is that he got away with it. Damn it! Whereas this man died insane. He was a kind of a hero. I feel the same way about certain modern writers. I've often said that Charles Baudelaire. You have to give Baudelaire credit. He died of drugs, just as this fellow did. Baudelaire didn't die of an overdose. He died of a lifetime overdose. That is his
addiction.
His brain went. He got softening of the brain. He saw that. He saw it just. If you had said to Baudelaire, "Ha, aren't we having fun?" He would have said, "My God, man, you don't know the truth about my philosophy." And you'd say, "Well, have you changed your philosophy?" And you'd say, "No, I still believe it, but it's terrible. And as I'm suffering the consequences of it." Whereas there's a certain kind of fellow, we have a lot of them around today, who Twitter and tweet and enjoy life without ever
they're kind of cheerful nihilists. Yes. They're especially in the academies right now. Who write books, and they're very popular, and they're enjoying great success. They're riding the crest of a kind of popular nihilism, especially in the academy, which of course always indicates the death of anything when it becomes popular in the academy. But when these people are perfectly cheerful, good-natured, rather often very pleasant people, laugh and joke, and you say to them, "Well, I thought that you thought everything was kind of nothing. I thought you were a nihilist." They say, "Oh, sure I am." But it doesn't seem to affect their behavior in any way at all. They act as if nothing had happened.
They're not serious.
No, they're not serious.
I guess what I'm saying is Count Dracula and Lucretius are serious. They take the consequences of their philosophy, and we all must. I suppose if we go back to the Greeks again, we said something like this when we talked about tragedy. That is, you do come out with a kind of horrified admiration for Euripides or Aeschylus. That is they see the thing for the way it is, and they stand for it. Whereas the nihilist that we're dealing with in the 20th century tends to be a fake.
Well, the very passage that I read is an indication of that kind of honesty. He says to you very candidly that the beauty that you see in this poem is not a representation of the way things really are. He says this is something that you can put over it as a kind of sweetening in order to attract people to it. He understands that people aren't going to be attracted to this philosophy in itself, that it's not attractive, it's not beautiful in itself. It doesn't represent the world as being beautiful at all. But he does admit that somehow you can see a kind of superficial beauty or a kind of appearance of beauty in things. And so he says, well, he's going to avail himself of that because he knows that it is attractive. And by gosh, that is,
it's amazing that he can do it.
Yeah, he tells you this is what I'm doing. There's no pretense here at all. And you always admire candor.
Yes.
That kind of candor. And that kind of honesty about the thing, because he admits many people are attracted to Lucretius because of his technical facility. He is technically a great master of language and of
it's not fair, really. He shouldn't have been.
Yeah. He's really very good. He has a technical proficiency which is superb. And a command of language and concept and image and all of those things that metaphor and so forth that poets have. And you will meet many a classicist who simply loves Lucretius and doesn't care anything about his philosophy. I mean, he himself is probably not a Lucretian in philosophy, but he simply, he weeps when he reads Lucretius. He knows he can recite Lucretius by heart, and it's the beauty that attracts him.
And Lucretius himself says it's all false.
Yeah, and Lucretius would say of him, he'd say, "Well, you've missed the point. You didn't read my poem. You just you skinned off the honey, and you didn't get the medicine."
He's funny, and they're not.
Yeah. No, they're kind of bored.
They're bored. They tend to be bored. Yeah. But he is. I say I can't ever get through thinking about Lucretius or reading without I'd have to use the word chuckle. It's not really laughter because you can't laugh. He's saying terrible things, but there's sort of a chuckle of a kind of wonder that a man can be that way, to see the world that way. But he really does. We've talked about his poetic now, his aesthetic. We've used the word beauty several times. Last time, I don't remember. A week ago now, we were talking together, but I think we were chiefly talking about his ethics, weren't we, last time? That is that famous passage, we had ended with that famous passage where he sits on the shore of the sea and looks out and sees the drowning people, and he says, now this is happiness, because we're safe from their drowning. Yeah. We can judge in our little citadel. And he uses that as an image for the whole universe. That is, the whole universe is drowning. The whole universe is falling. It's all going to ruins, but the philosopher can withdraw from it and have a little garden or a little tower, a hotel by the sea. And from the safety, and it is only a temporary thing, he can have a secure, momentarily only, but nonetheless secure life. And the happiness will be really of his own construction. Now, I suppose we can make a very profound and obvious remark here. People's views about right and wrong, and their views about what's beautiful and ugly, are dependent always upon something much more basic than that. We usually call it their philosophy of life. We used to call this course the Integrated Humanities Program, and we insisted that you really can't talk about poetry in isolation from everything else, and you can't talk about everything else in isolation from everything else. You have to talk about everything. I always recall that passage of Plato where in the Republic, one of the boys, Adamantus, or one of them says, Socrates, if you pursue this line of thought, we're going to be talking about the whole of human life. And Socrates says, now you've got it. Now you've got it. Yes, that's right. That's what we're going to do.
Yeah. Well, it struck me recently. I don't know. It's one of those things you come back to. That in every great poem, is about everything. That every great philosophy is about everything. And that really any great book, if you're to call a book a great book, it has to be about everything.
Maybe that's what we need.
That's maybe great. Maybe, yeah, that it includes everything. You can't read it. You can. I mean, I'd be willing to say that if you pick up a single line of a great lyric and read it, the more you think about it, the more you say, well, that really includes everything. It's about the whole of our experience and the world.
It was our objection to the modern university is that it was departmentalized. It was specialized, and people excluded. Well, that's not I'm not going to talk about that. I'm an atomic physicist, and that's that.
Right.
Now, if you want to talk about something else, I'd be glad to, but I'm just an amateur. But my field is, and courses in the humanities were organized all over the place. It was a very popular thing to have what they called interdisciplinary courses or interdepartmental courses. And we always said, no, our course is not interdisciplinary. We're not bundling several separate disciplines. We're talking about everything at once.
Because that's the way it is. Really, it's the way life is from moment to moment.
And then they say, experience. Who is competent? They would say, well, the poets are competent. The great writers are competent. Yeah. Whether they may be poets or they may be scientists. It's hard to know what Lucretius is.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. He was always one of my favorite examples. I'd say, well, you tell me what Lucretius is. Should he be studied by poetic experts or philosophical experts, or by physicists? Because he is
the greatest articulator of the atomic theory that we have. Again, we have the Greek Democritus, but we don't know anything. I mean, we only know by inference, really, what he taught. But we have a whole book here by a man who was a member of that school. And he believed in atoms, and he describes them very well. It's never been done better from a scientific point of view. And we have to come. I think today, maybe we ought to come face to face with this. That is, if you ask, why is it that Lucretius has this view that everything is terrible, that nature is something absolutely an abomination, something utterly hostile to human existence? Well, what is his justification for that view? We might approach it in a lot of different ways. It may very well have been simply his own experience. It may have been an unhappy love affair. I don't know. But we do know that he accepted a whole metaphysical view of the universe, which is perfectly integral with his experience. And we call that atomism. That is, he believed that existence, the whole of existence, is nothing but infinitesimal particles falling through a void, and that's all there is.
Yeah, when Mr. Senior made the joke about the rain falling, of course he was thinking of the atoms.
It's a vision.
Atoms, because they fall.
They fall.
They do fall.
You wonder why.
Yeah, you wonder why. But that's the motion. It's a downward motion. Yeah.
Nobody ever says they go up.
No. No, they fall.
Which is, of course, a difficulty in their theory. That's not explainable. If everything is nothing but atoms in the void, I guess the best refutation of the whole system is, well, why do they fall? But there they are. The modernists sometimes will say, well, it's random motion. But no. It's not random motion. They fall. But anyway, we won't.
Well, it's a descriptive philosophy. That is, all atomic philosophies are descriptive philosophies. They really don't care very much. They don't care about causes. It's not ultimate causes. That is, why do the atoms fall? Well, there's no answer to that question. They just fall. They fall. And where do they come from? That is, you can ask the question about what makes them fall, or toward what do they fall. And the answer in both instances is, well, that's not my business. That's not the business of the philosopher. A philosopher simply describes things as they are, and the way they are is that the atoms fall.
If you say where do they come from, they answer they always were.
Yeah. Well, they're eternal. Yeah.
That's all there is. Yeah. They didn't come from anywhere.
And they're not going anywhere either, because they'll always be. They're indestructible, of course. They can't be destroyed.
Now, if you hold that view, that that's all there is, there are particles, and these particles make up everything else. Now, I know today where there's a minor confusion. It's so minor that I don't know whether we even ought to bother to dismiss it. The only difficulty I find with it is words. That is, it's a little bit hard to talk about because it involves two uses of the same word, and that's always difficult. Today, we talk about splitting the atom. We say, well, the atom has been split. Today, we have electrons and protons and things that I don't know much about. So the atom has been split. Well, Lucretius would say, oh, no, then you didn't understand what I meant by atom. What I mean by atom is this. There must be some ultimate unsplittable particle. Now, if you can split something that physicists described as an atom 100 years ago, and now they've found out that there are smaller things, that wouldn't bother Lucretius at all. He'd say, well, that's always been true.
He said, well, if the electron, protons, neutrons, if those are the ultimate particles, well, then they're the
right.
What I mean by the word atom,
means unsplittable.
The word atom it's a negative word. A is a negative kind of prefix, and the tom it means something that which cannot be divided. So whether it's what modern physicists or what 19th century physicists call the atom, or whether it's what modern physicists call the particles, the electrons, neutrons, protons, so forth, and any others that they may find, if they split those, it doesn't make any difference to Lucretius at all. It's the unsplittable.
He says there must be, and he generates it as a necessary fact of the universe. There must be some ultimate, unsplittable, eternal, permanent particle, out of which all these other things are made.
Now, one thing about this is a deductive philosophy. That is, he is reasoning. This is not an experimental philosophy. It's a real philosophy. In other words, he's asking questions.
It's not science in that modern
it's not science in the modern sense.
Experimental
science. He's not looking at them through some sort of counter or instrument or something of that sort. He's saying, well, it seems necessary. If you look at the world, it seems necessary to conclude that it must all be made up of these invisible and undividable little particles, which are the ultimate. They make up what the universe is.
And they have to move. They're in motion, and therefore there has to be space. Otherwise, they wouldn't.
Yes,
if they were all solidly together, then the universe would be static. So he has to postulate what he calls the void, or space. We would call it space, matter and space. And matter for him is these little indivisible particles. Now, he does use a famous and obvious analogy, and I think many people have been put off by that. He says, have you ever seen dust in the sunlight? On an afternoon when the sunlight comes through your western window, if you've got a living room like I have, there's going to be a lot of these tiny little dust particles floating around. Now, he said they look something like that, and then some people laugh, and they say, oh, well, of course, that's so foolish, because we know now that those dust particles are certainly divisible into small things. No, he's just making an analogy, really. He doesn't believe that the world's made up of dust particles. He's just saying it looks like that.
No,
and it's as good as any.
He says the stones are made up of atoms. You remember very early on, he says, well, you notice that when water runs over stone, that eventually the stone wears away. He says, well, how do you account for that? Well, it's made up of these tiny little microscopic, or you wouldn't say microscopic, invisible, not visible to us, little particles that wear away. They wash away. You can't see them wash away. It takes hundreds of years for a stone to be worn away by water. One kind of atom moving over another kind of atom, or things made up of these atoms, gradually washes those little tiny particles away. It's perfectly reasonable kind of thing to say. It sounds like it makes sense perfectly well.
It explains
the phenomenon. And that's what you're attempting to do.
I don't know whether this is true or not. You've read a lot of in modern science. Did anybody? It stands to reason that they might have, when they first invented the microscope. Did somebody think that he was going to see the atom? I suppose they did. That is, they invented a microscope, and now we will see the atom.
Well, I don't know if anybody thought of it exactly in that way, but they did have the idea that they were going to get closer to those ultimate. They saw cells.
Yeah, but I wonder whether they weren't fooled into thinking, this is it. I could imagine if I held this theory, for example, and had watched the water wash away the rock, that one day I would discover granules of sand, and I would say, aha, the sand is the atom. But then, of course, very quickly you realize that isn't it, because the sand washes the sand itself to some extent.
Actually, a lot of the very early scientists in the 16th century weren't atomists at all. Like, one of the only.
So they weren't looking for.
Gassendi was one of the very few people who was a real atomist, and he wasn't an experimental scientist. Well, I guess he was, but he wasn't into microscopes.
So it came back actually later.
It came back later. The atomic theory. Oh, a lot of people thought it was a plausible theory, but a lot of people didn't. They weren't interested in the theory at all until later.
I see. I didn't. I just wondered whether. I can imagine a certain kind of scientist thinking that he was going to find the atom, like the way in the 18th century, Swedenborg really thought it was going to be possible to find heaven. That if everything's physical, you're going to find it. It's just a matter of how you get there. And you remember the Russian cosmonaut in his famous remark who was in outer space, and he said, "Well, there isn't any heaven. I've been up here and I've looked around.
See God.
Didn't see God."
Well, I still meet actually the scientists who think that people can see atoms now.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
I've met people who are have PhDs in the university that you would think would know better, who have the idea that when you look through what they call an electron microscope, that you see the atoms, and you say to them, "Well, you're not seeing the atoms. You're seeing."
Highly complex beings.
You're seeing something on a screen which is a reflection of some phenomenon that you can't see, and it's just that when that phenomenon occurs, it trips off some sort of electrical device in your machine, and you say when you see that little flash, that's the electron. But you're not seeing the electron. You're seeing the result of what they call the electron. Nobody's seen an atom.
Pretty far removed.
Nobody's seen an atom.
But even the electron will turn out to be, I'm sure, a highly complex being.
Oh, yeah. Well, they're
made
beginning
of parts.
Exactly.
It's not going to be easy to catch the atom. I don't think. But I could imagine that they think that they are. Now we've got it. Now.
Well, a lot of philosophers, or not? No, I shouldn't say a lot. Some philosophers will say, the whole business about the atom is absurd. It's a contradiction in terms. I mean, we're talking about matter, aren't we? Now, if we're talking about matter, what you mean by matter is something that is divisible.
By definition.
By definition. You're not talking about an indivisible. You're not talking about a simple thing.
Aristotle would say that.
Yeah, this is what Aristotle
he would say. The atom is the concept of an atom is contradictory.
Yeah, you can't. That is, a simple substance is always a spiritual thing, like the soul. You can't divide the soul. It isn't the kind of thing that can be divided. But as long as you're talking about matter, it can always be divided. There's no such thing as an indivisible particle. It's impossible.
If it occupies space.
Yeah, then it has to be divisible.
It has extension. Then it's going to be what we call infinitely divisible. And
maybe those phenomena that they're observing aren't. I don't know. Maybe they aren't material things. I don't know. But if they are, as they seem to be, then they will be divisible.
Although it would be theoretically possible to have a being that would be divisible but not divided. That is to say, not actually divided. That is, it's possible to have an atom in the universe. I suppose that is, you could always cut it in half, but if you did, it would be the same thing as when if you cut a piece of butter in half, it's two pieces of butter. But it's possible to think of an ultimate material being, but nobody's ever found it.
I don't know. I don't know. I can't remember who it is that I've read who simply denies that. Probably Guénon or somebody like that who says that's just impossible. It's
that it would be.